All right, let's go. You wanted to go deep into Old Testament history. And I
Yeah,
have to say, the sources you sent are a gold mine. We are about to go on a journey
we are.
through thousands of years,
Absolutely.
hitting not just the highlights,
Right.
but some fascinating nuggets you might not have known.
hmm
Think of it as your express lane through the Old Testament,
Okay.
but with some scenic detours along the way.
I like that.
How do you think about that?
I think that's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you'll be surprised by
Right.
how these ancient stories
Yeah.
still resonate today.
Totally.
They grapple with,
Right.
timeless themes.
Right.
Right.
Faith, betrayal,
Mm.
power,
Mm.
and ultimately that persistent human struggle to understand our place
Right.
in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, that's good. Exactly. We've got this incredible source that lays out the events almost like an Old Testament History 101 lecture.
Okay.
But our mission here is to go beyond just the facts.
We're digging into the why behind the what.
Motivations.
By the end of this,
Yeah.
you'll have a framework for understanding the major players,
Right.
the turning points,
Mm-hmm.
and why this history still matters thousands of years later.
Yeah, and it's more than just a history lesson.
Right.
It's
Totally.
a story that's still being written, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
The story that we're all a part of.
Okay.
So let's dive in then. Where better to start
Right.
than with the very beginning?
Let's do it.
The creation account in Genesis
Yeah.
sets the stage
Yeah.
for everything that follows.
Yeah.
It's not just about
Right.
the physical world coming into being.
Yeah.
It's about the relationship between humanity and the divine.
Right from the start, we see this idea of a covenant, a unique bond
Right.
between God and humanity.
Mm-hmm.
But then, of course, there's the Garden of Eden
Right.
and the fall. Paradise lost, right? I mean, talk about a bad decision with some seriously long-lasting consequences. And what's fascinating to me is how this sets up the central tension that runs through the entire Old Testament.
Right.
The struggle with sin,
Oh, wow.
the longing for redemption.
Exactly. And it's not just a theological concept.
Yeah.
It's something we can all relate to, right?
Yeah.
That pull between our best intentions
Mm-hmm.
and our tendency to mess things up.
Yeah.
We see this play out immediately with Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
Jealousy, rage,
Yeah.
the first murder.
Right.
Humanity descends into darkness pretty quickly.
Wow. Yeah. Things go downhill fast.
Yeah.
But amidst the chaos,
Right.
there's this thread of hope,
Right.
the lineage of Seth,
Mm-hmm.
carrying the promise of redemption forward.
Right.
You know?
It's a reminder that even when things look bleak,
Right.
God's plan is still unfolding.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we come to Noah.
Right.
Now, you might think you know the story of the Ark and the flood, but have you ever considered its geopolitical implications?
Whoa. I have to admit, that one never crossed my mind.
Okay.
Explain that to me.
Well, after the flood subsides,
Right.
Noah has 3 sons,
Okay.
Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
Mm-hmm.
They become the progenitors of different people groups
Okay.
spreading out across the earth.
Right.
Shem's descendants become the Semitic nations.
Okay.
Ham's the African and Asian nations,
Mm-hmm.
and Japheth's the European nations.
Okay.
It's fascinating how this early division in Noah's family foreshadows the development of different cultures and civilizations throughout history.
Right.
You see, even in this ancient story,
Right.
there are layers of meaning that connect to the bigger picture.
Okay, that's mind-blowing. It's like this ancient family tree is branching out and influencing the course of human history.
It is. It's like a family tree for the whole world.
I'm starting to see how these seemingly simple stories have such deep roots and far-reaching consequences.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And that brings us to Abraham, often called the father of many nations.
Right.
Now, he wasn't chosen because he was perfect.
Yeah.
In fact, he makes plenty of mistakes.
Right.
But he's willing to leave everything behind,
Yeah.
to trust God's promises,
Yeah.
even when they seem impossible.
Right.
He's stepping out in faith.
And that's where the covenant gets even more interesting, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not just about God blessing Abraham. It's about Abraham's descendants becoming a blessing to all nations.
The whole world.
It's this incredible ripple effect of faith and obedience. I mean, talk about a legacy.
It's a legacy that continues to this day.
Yeah, yeah,
And think about this.
yeah.
God prophesies to Abraham
Right.
that his descendants will be enslaved for 430 years.
Wow.
It's foreshadowing centuries in
Goodness.
advance
Yeah.
the Israelites' time in Egypt.
Okay, so we've got this prophecy hanging over Abraham's family.
Right.
A reminder that even amidst blessings,
Yeah.
there will be challenges.
There will be trials. And then there's the story of Sarah, Hagar, and Ishmael.
Yes.
It's a bit messy.
It is a bit messy.
To say the least.
You could say that. And it reflects a very real human drama.
Right.
The complexities of family relationships
Right.
and the painful consequences of choices made in desperation.
Wow.
Sarah, unable to conceive,
Okay.
gives her servant Hagar to Abraham,
Right.
leading to the birth of Ishmael.
Okay.
But later,
Right.
Sarah miraculously conceives Isaac.
Right. And this sets up a conflict that has echoed through history.
Yeah.
Ishmael becomes the father of the Arab people, while Isaac's line leads to the Israelites.
Right.
It's a reminder that even within families,
Right.
there can be divisions,
Yeah.
rivalries,
Yeah.
and long-standing tensions.
It's a powerful reminder of the human capacity for both love and conflict.
Yeah, well said.
And speaking of conflict, we can't forget the near sacrifice of Isaac.
Oh, yeah.
It's a story that raises profound questions about faith,
Right.
obedience.
And the nature of sacrifice.
It's a gut-wrenching story, but it also highlights God's provision, right?
Yes.
He provides a ram at the last moment,
Right.
a substitutionary sacrifice.
Yes,
It's a powerful foreshadowing
it is.
of the ultimate sacrifice
Yeah.
that Jesus would make centuries later.
You're right. It's a story that points to the heart of the gospel message.
Yeah.
The idea that someone else takes our place,
Wow.
bears the burden of our sin.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the next generation,
Okay.
Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph.
Okay.
Each of their stories contributes to the unfolding drama of God's plan.
All right, let's unpack this. We've got Isaac, whose story seems a bit
A
quieter
little bit, yeah.
compared to his father's.
Compared to Abraham's, yeah.
But his marriage to Rebekah and the birth of their twin sons, Esau and Jacob, set the stage for another pivotal division.
Exactly. Esau becomes the father of the Edomites,
Okay.
who would later be rivals of Israel.
Okay.
Jacob, on the other hand, has this incredible encounter with God, wrestling all night,
Well,
and emerging with a new name, Israel.
wait, he wrestled with God. Tell me more about that. It sounds intense.
It is.
Yeah.
It's a story of struggle,
Okay.
transformation,
Right.
and the persistence of faith.
Okay.
Jacob the trickster,
Yeah.
the one who's always trying to outsmart others,
Right.
finally confronts the ultimate power.
Yeah.
And in that struggle,
Yeah.
he's broken.
Mm-hmm.
He's changed.
Yeah.
He's given a new identity.
Okay. Right.
It's a reminder that our encounters with God can be both challenging and transformative.
Wow, that's powerful. It makes me think about our own struggles, our own wrestling with faith and doubt.
Right.
And then there's Joseph. His story is like a roller coaster of betrayal, mistaken identity, and ultimately redemption.
Yes.
It's got all the makings of a great drama. What are some of the key takeaways from Joseph's story?
Well, on one level,
Yeah.
it's a story about family dysfunction,
Right.
jealousy, and forgiveness.
Okay.
But on a deeper level,
Right.
it's a testament to God's sovereignty,
Yeah.
his ability to work through even the most difficult circumstances
Right.
to bring about his purposes.
Okay.
Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers,
Yeah.
grossly accused,
Right.
imprisoned,
Mm-hmm.
but ultimately rises to power in Egypt.
Right. He interprets dreams, saves Egypt from famine, and ultimately forgives his brothers. It's a story of resilience, forgiveness, and the unexpected ways in which God can use even our pain for good.
Exactly. And it sets the stage for the next major chapter,
Okay.
the Israelites' time in Egypt and the Exodus.
Right.
Remember that prophecy given to Abraham about his descendants being enslaved for 430 years?
Yeah.
Well, this is where it all comes to fruition.
And that's where we'll pick up next time, right? With the arrival of Moses, the plagues, the parting of the Red Sea. I can't wait to dive into that.
We've only just begun our journey. Buckle up, because things are about to get even more epic.
Welcome back. Last time we left off with Joseph rising to power in Egypt and setting the stage for the Israelites' arrival. You know, it's incredible to think about how one man's story can have such far-reaching consequences.
It really does highlight the interconnectedness of history, doesn't it? And how seemingly insignificant events can have a ripple effect across generations. In Joseph's case, his actions ultimately saved not only his family, but also the entire Egyptian nation from famine. This paved the way for the Israelites to settle in Egypt, where the population would multiply rapidly.
Right. But as we know, things weren't always smooth sailing for the Israelites in Egypt. That prophecy about 430 years of slavery was still looming, and a new pharaoh came to power who didn't remember Joseph or his kindness.
Exactly. And this is where the story of Moses begins. Born into slavery, hidden among the bulrushes, raised in Pharaoh's court talk about a dramatic entrance. He's chosen by God to be the deliverer of his people, leading them out of bondage and into the promised land.
It's a story that has inspired people for centuries. The plagues, the parting of the Red Sea, the escape from Pharaoh's army. It's also epic. What strikes me is how God uses these incredible displays of power to demonstrate his sovereignty and his commitment to his people.
You're right. The Exodus is a defining moment in Israelite history. It's not just a physical liberation, it's a spiritual liberation as well. They're freed from the tyranny of Pharaoh, but more importantly, they're freed from the bondage of slavery and oppression.
And speaking of liberation, we can't forget about the revelation at Mount Sinai. This is where God establishes his covenant with Israel, giving them the Ten Commandments and the Torah. It's the foundation of their religious identity and their relationship with God.
Absolutely. The covenant at Sinai is a pivotal moment. It's a two-way agreement. God promises to protect and bless his people, and in return, they promise to obey his laws and live according to his ways.
So it's not just about following rules for the sake of following rules. It's about living in right relationship with God, honoring him, and reflecting his character in the world.
Exactly. The Ten Commandments, for example, are more than just a list of thou shalt nots. They're a reflection of God's moral character, a guide for living a just and righteous life. And the Torah, it's a comprehensive set of laws that covers everything from worship and rituals to social justice and ethical behavior.
You know, it's fascinating how this ancient legal code still influences our understanding of morality and ethics today. The principles of justice, fairness, and compassion that are woven throughout the Torah continue to resonate with people of all faiths.
It's a testament to the enduring wisdom of these ancient texts. But as you know, even with the best intentions, things don't always go according to plan. The Israelites, despite witnessing God's power firsthand, struggle with doubt, fear, and disobedience.
Right. Those 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. Talk about a detour. I mean, they're so close to the promised land, but their lack of faith, their fear of the giants, causes them to miss out on God's blessing.
It's a stark reminder that freedom isn't just about escaping physical bondage. It's about conquering our inner fears and trusting God's promises, even when they seem impossible.
And what about Joshua and Caleb? They're the only ones from that generation who actually get to enter the promised land. It's a powerful example of the difference between faith and fear.
It really is. Joshua and Caleb embody that unwavering trust in God, that willingness to step out in faith even when everyone else is doubting. And because of their faithfulness, they experience the fulfillment of God's promises.
So after 40 years of wandering, the Israelites finally enter the promised land under Joshua's leadership. But it's not just a smooth ride, right? There are still battles to be fought, challenges to overcome.
Exactly. The conquest of Canaan is a long and arduous process. And even after they settle in the land, they continue to face threats from surrounding nations. It's during this time that we enter the period of the Judges, a tumultuous era marked by cycles of sin, oppression, repentance, and deliverance.
It sounds a bit like a roller coaster, up and down, up and down. Why do you think they struggled so much during this period?
Well, a key factor is the lack of a central authority. They didn't have a king during this time. The book of Judges tells us that everyone did what was right in his own eyes, which led to moral and spiritual decline. They drifted away from God, adopted the practices of their pagan neighbors, and faced the consequences of their disobedience.
So it's like they traded one form of slavery to Egypt for another form of slavery to their own desires and impulses.
That's a great insight, and it's a pattern we see repeated throughout history, isn't it? When we turn away from God, we often end up enslaved to something else.
Right.
Power, wealth, addiction, fear.
It's a reminder that true freedom is found in surrendering to God's authority, in aligning our lives with his will. But tell me more about these judges. Were there any standout figures during this period?
Oh, absolutely. We've got Gideon, the reluctant warrior who defeats the Midianites with a tiny army and a lot of faith. There's Deborah, the prophetess and judge, a remarkable woman who leads Israel to victory against the Canaanites. And of course, there's Samson, the legendary strongman with a weakness for Philistine women, a classic tale of strength, temptation, and tragic downfall.
I love how each of these judges embodies a different aspect of leadership, a different way in which God can use ordinary people to accomplish extraordinary things. It's inspiring to see how they rise to the occasion, overcoming their own weaknesses and limitations to deliver their people.
They're a reminder that God doesn't always choose the most qualified or the most obvious candidates for his purposes.
Yeah.
He often chooses the unlikely, the humble, the ones who are willing to trust him, even when they don't feel capable.
And then there's Samuel, who serves as both a judge and a prophet. He's kind of a bridge figure, right? Transitioning Israel from the era of the judges to the era of kings.
Exactly. The Israelites, tired of the cycles of sin and oppression, decide they want a king, just like the other nations. It's a significant shift, a move away from theocracy, where God is seen as the ultimate ruler, toward monarchy, where a human king sits on the throne.
But isn't this desire for a king a rejection of God's authority in a way?
That's a great question. And it's something the prophet Samuel warns them about. He tells them that having a king will mean higher taxes, forced labor, and ultimately a loss of their freedom. But they're determined to have their way. And so God allows them to have a king.
And who's chosen as the first king of Israel?
Saul. He's tall, handsome, impressive, everything you might imagine in a king. But despite his outward appearance, he lacks the inner qualities of a true leader. He's insecure, disobedient, and ultimately he loses God's favor.
It's a classic example of how outward appearances can be deceiving. What happened to Saul?
Well, his reign is marked by a series of poor decisions and acts of disobedience. He fails to follow God's commands, he allows pride and jealousy to consume him, and eventually he meets a tragic end on the battlefield.
It's a reminder that even those in positions of power are not above the consequences of their choices. And then we come to David, perhaps the most famous king of Israel, the shepherd boy who slays Goliath, the warrior poet, the man after God's own heart. It's a dramatic rise to power.
David is a complex and fascinating character. He's a skilled warrior, a brilliant strategist, a gifted musician, and a man of deep faith. He unites the tribes of Israel, establishes Jerusalem as the capital, and expands the kingdom's borders. He truly embodies the ideal of a righteous king.
But as we know, even David wasn't perfect. He had his share of flaws and made some pretty significant mistakes. His affair with Bathsheba and the subsequent cover-up, it's a dark chapter in his story.
It is. And it shows that even those who are close to God, even those who are considered heroes, are still capable of great sin. But what's important is that David repents. He acknowledges his wrongdoing, he accepts the consequences, and he seeks God's forgiveness.
It's a reminder that God's grace is available to all, even those who have fallen short. And after David, we have Solomon, his son, known for his wisdom, wealth, and the building of the temple.
Solomon's reign is a golden age for Israel. He expands the kingdom, builds impressive structures, and fosters trade relations with other nations. And of course, there's that famous story of him asking God for wisdom, a request that God grants him abundantly.
You know, it's interesting how Solomon starts out so well with such promise, but then as his wealth and power grow, his heart seems to drift away from God. He accumulates hundreds of wives and concubines, many of whom worship foreign gods, and he even builds temples to these gods.
It's a cautionary tale, isn't it? A reminder that power, wealth, and even wisdom can be corrupting forces if they're not grounded in a deep and abiding relationship with God.
So even the wisest of kings can stumble. What happens to the kingdom after Solomon's death?
Well, sadly, his reign ends in division. His son, Rehoboam, refuses to listen to the people's cries for relief from the heavy taxes and forced labor imposed by his father. This leads to a rebellion, and the kingdom splits in two. The northern kingdom, called Israel, and the southern kingdom, called Judah.
It's a pivotal moment, marking the beginning of a new and tumultuous era in Israelite history. And that's where we'll pick up next time, right? With the divided kingdom, the rise and fall of kings, and ultimately the path toward exile.
You got it. We'll explore the challenges they face, the prophets who speak out against their sin, and the consequences of turning away from God.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Old Testament history. Last time we left off with a kingdom divided, setting the stage for a tumultuous period in Israel's story.
It's almost like a family feud on an epic scale, right? Two kingdoms, both claiming to be the true heirs of God's promises, but heading down very different paths.
That's a great analogy. And these paths diverge pretty dramatically.
Right.
The northern kingdom, Israel,
falls into a pattern of idolatry and disobedience almost immediately.
They go through a string of 19 kings, and not a single one follows God's ways. It's a pretty stark contrast to the legacy of David and Solomon, wouldn't you say?
It really is. You see, they established worship centers at Bethel and Dan,
Okay.
essentially creating rivals to the temple in Jerusalem.
Right.
It was a political move,
Yeah.
an attempt to consolidate power.
Right.
But it also represented a rejection of God's chosen place of worship.
They're trying to rewrite the rules, create their own version of faith, but it ends up leading them further and further away from God.
Exactly. And during this time,
Yeah.
God raises up prophets like Amos, Hosea, and Micah to speak out against their sin, to warn them of the consequences of their actions.
Right.
These prophets deliver some pretty fiery messages condemning their idolatry, their injustice, their hypocrisy.
Imagine being one of those prophets trying to get the attention of a nation that's so lost in its own ways.
Yeah.
It must have been a tough gig.
It certainly wasn't easy.
Yeah.
They faced persecution, rejection, even threats to their lives.
Right.
But they remained faithful to their calling, speaking truth to power, even when it was unpopular.
It makes me think about the importance of speaking up for what's right.
Yeah.
Even when it's difficult.
Absolutely.
Even when it's costly. But sadly, it seems like the Northern Kingdom didn't heed their warnings.
No, they didn't.
Yeah.
And eventually, the consequences of their actions catch up with them.
Right.
In 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire, a powerful and ruthless force sweeps through the region, conquering the Northern Kingdom and scattering the Israelites into exile.
It's a tragic end to a kingdom that had so much potential. What about the Southern Kingdom, Judah? Do they fare any better?
Judah's story is a bit more complicated.
Okay.
They have a mixed bag of kings,
right?
Some who follow God's ways, and some who fall into the same patterns of idolatry and disobedience as the Northern Kingdom.
Okay.
But even during times of spiritual revival, there's this underlying tension, this struggle to remain faithful to God's covenant.
So even in the South, where there's at least some attempt to hold on to God's ways, there's still this constant pull toward compromise, toward straying from the path.
Exactly. And it's during this period that we see prophets like Isaiah, Micah, Joel, Zephaniah, and Jeremiah speaking to Judah.
Right.
They're calling the people back to God, urging them to repent,
right,
to turn away from their wickedness.
They're like watchmen on the wall,
yes,
sounding the alarm,
right,
trying to wake the people up to the danger they're in.
That's a great image. They're warning of impending judgment, but they're also offering hope. They're pointing to a future restoration.
Yeah.
A time when God will bring his people back from exile and establish his kingdom on earth.
It's a message that echoes throughout the Old Testament, this tension between judgment and mercy.
Right.
Between the consequences of sin and the promise of redemption.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And sadly, Judah, despite moments of revival, ultimately follows the path of the Northern Kingdom.
Yeah.
They continue in their idolatry, their injustice, their rejection of God's ways.
Right.
And in 586 BC, the Babylonian Empire, under King Nebuchadnezzar, conquers Jerusalem, destroys the temple, and takes the people of Judah into exile.
It's a devastating blow. The destruction of their holy city, the scattering of their people. What happens to the Israelites in exile? How do they hold on to their faith, their identity in a foreign land?
Well, the exile is a time of profound crisis and reflection.
Okay.
They're forced to confront their sin.
It's their brokenness, their need for God.
Yeah.
And it's during this time that prophets like Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel minister to them, offering words of comfort, challenge, and hope.
So even in the midst of their suffering, even in the depths of their despair, God is still present, still speaking to them. Still guiding them.
Exactly. The prophets remind them that God has not abandoned them, that he still has a plan for their future, that their exile is not the end of the story.
And eventually, after 70 years of exile, the Persian Empire, under King Cyrus, conquers Babylon and allows the Jewish people to return to their homeland. It's an incredible moment of restoration.
Yes.
A testament to God's faithfulness to his promises.
It really is. And it's during this time that we see leaders like Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah stepping up to rebuild the temple, reestablish the law, and restore the city of Jerusalem. You know, it's inspiring to see how even after such a traumatic experience, they find the strength and resilience to rebuild their lives, their community, their faith.
It's a powerful reminder. that even when things seem hopeless,
Right.
even when we've lost everything, God can still bring about restoration.
Yeah.
He can still make beauty from ashes.
And as we move into the intertestamental period,
Yes.
those 400 years of silence between the Old and New Testaments, we see the stage being set for the arrival of Jesus.
Exactly. It's a crucial period, often overlooked,
Right.
but so important for understanding the context in which Jesus enters the world.
Yeah.
During this time, the Old Testament is translated into Greek, making it accessible to a wider audience.
Right.
Alexander the Great's conquests spread Hellenistic culture and the Greek language, which would later become the language of the New Testament.
So in a way, these historical and cultural shifts are paving the way for the spread of the gospel.
They are. And then there's the rise of the Roman Empire,
Right.
which brings Pax Romana, a period of relative peace and stability
Okay.
that allows for easier travel and communication throughout the Roman world.
Yeah.
This would later play a key role in the spread of Christianity.
It's amazing how God orchestrates these seemingly unrelated events, weaving them together to accomplish his purposes.
It really is.
Right.
But the intertestamental period isn't without its challenges for the Jewish people.
Right.
They face oppression under various rulers,
Right.
including the Seleucid king Antiochus Epiphanes,
Right.
who tries to force them to abandon their faith and adopt Greek customs.
Right. He even desecrates the temple,
He does.
sacrificing a pig on the altar,
Yeah.
which sparks the Maccabean revolt.
Exactly.
Right.
Led by Judas Maccabeus and his brothers,
Right.
the Jewish people fight for their religious freedom
Right.
and eventually reclaim control of the temple.
Yeah.
This victory is still celebrated today
Right.
as Hanukkah,
Right.
the Festival of Lights.
It's a reminder that God's people are not always passive victims.
Yeah,
They're called to resist oppression,
right.
to fight for what's right, to stand up for their faith,
Yes.
even when it's costly.
It's a powerful example of courage and resilience. But sadly,
Yeah.
their hard-won independence doesn't last long.
Right.
The Roman Empire, under Pompey the Great,
Mm-hmm.
conquers Jerusalem in 63 BC,
Okay.
bringing Judea under Roman rule.
And that's where Herod the Great enters the picture. He's a fascinating character, a shrewd politician,
Right.
a master builder,
Yeah.
but also a ruthless tyrant, paranoid and obsessed with power.
He was a complex figure, full of contradictions.
Right.
He expands and renovates the temple in Jerusalem,
Right.
making it one of the most impressive structures in the ancient world.
Right.
But he's also responsible for the deaths of many people,
Yeah.
including members of his own family,
Right.
in his quest to secure his throne.
It's a reminder that even those who achieve great things can be driven by dark motives, by fear, by ambition, by a
Right.
thirst for power.
It's a cautionary tale.
Right.
And it's against this backdrop of Roman rule,
Right.
political intrigue,
Yeah.
and messianic expectations that Jesus is born.
It's an incredible moment.
It is.
The culmination of centuries of history, the
Yeah.
fulfillment of God's promises. The Old Testament ends with this sense of anticipation,
Right.
this longing for the coming of the Messiah,
Yes.
the one who would save his people from their sins.
And that's the beauty of the Old Testament, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's not just a collection of stories.
Right.
It's a story that points forward,
Yeah.
a story that finds its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus Christ.
It's been an incredible journey exploring the twists and turns of Old Testament history.
Yeah.
I feel like we've only scratched the surface,
Yeah.
but I've gained a much deeper appreciation for the complexity, the drama,
Right.
the enduring relevance of these ancient stories.
Me too.
Yeah.
And I hope you have as well.
Right.
As you continue to explore the Bible,
Yeah.
I encourage you to keep digging,
Right.
keep asking questions,
Mm-hmm.
keep making connections between these ancient texts and your own life today.
Yeah. Well said.
The Old Testament is full of wisdom,
Right.
insight,
Mhm.
and inspiration that can speak to us across the centuries.
That's a great reminder. So, as we wrap up our deep dive, what stands out to you as the most important takeaway? What do you hope our listeners will remember from this exploration of Old Testament history?
I think the most important takeaway is that we're all part of a much bigger story,
Yeah.
a story that began long before us
Right.
and will continue long after we're gone.
Mm-hmm.
It's a story of God's love for humanity,
Right.
his faithfulness to his promises,
Yeah.
his desire to redeem and restore what's broken.
It's a story of hope,
Yeah.
a story of grace, a story that ultimately points us to Jesus, the one who makes all things new.
Beautifully said. And on that note,
Yeah.
I think we'll wrap up this deep dive.
All right.
Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through the Old Testament.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
But there's always more to discover.
Right.
Keep exploring.
Yeah.
Keep questioning.
Right.
Keep seeking.
Yeah.
And you'll be amazed at what you find.
Couldn't agree more.
Until next time.
Keep diving deep into the richness of God's Word.
Absolutely.